So I'll welcome everybody again. And in the background is Maury Bouchard, and he has filled in expertly for Bob Bailey this weekend and has been our technical person. So we want to thank him publicly here.
Thank you, Peter. You're welcome. Happy to help.
Thank you, Maury. And I'd like to introduce, without further ado, Tom Gilbert, who we were beginning to wonder, like when we were talking about doing this symposium live down at St. Francis College in Brooklyn and downtown Brooklyn, the plan was going to be, well, we were pretty much in a historic neighborhood, and within a short walk, there were just a number of baseball sites that we could kind of walk past and visit, and Tom would say a few words about them. And then when we realized we had a Zoom situation coming, Tom came up with the idea of, hey, guess what? I could put together a video and we could go far and wide, because I have almost a year to do it, or whatever it was, 6 months. And so Tom and his son produced this video historic tour of Brooklyn for our edification now. So Tom, I'll turn it over to you if you want to.
Okay, one question. Are you seeing it full screen yet?
I am, yes.
All right, so you guys are seeing the full screen video.
We can still see you.
Yeah.
We can see you on the sidebar. Yeah.
Okay, so
your image on Brooklyn Heights on the promenade.
all right, so I'm gonna shut myself off, but I'll start the video. How's that?
Okay.
Okay. We have no idea at all when baseball started, but we do know where it started. It started in New York City. And in the 19th century, New York City meant that island over my right shoulder, the island of Manhattan. Brooklyn, where I'm standing now, was a separate entity, the city of Brooklyn, before 1898. So as far back as the 18th century, we have bits of evidence that a game called baseball was played in Lower Manhattan, mostly by children. During the early part of the 19th century, there were a few quasi-organized and organized baseball clubs played by adults. But as late as 1854, when William Van Cott, a president of the Gotham Baseball Club, wrote a letter trying to encourage interest in baseball, a letter to the newspapers, he bragged that there were 3 clubs with 90 members. And that's really the entire world of baseball before it took a great evolutionary leap forward into becoming a modern sport. And the first step in that evolution was crossing the East River to the city of Brooklyn. Here we are at 133 Clinton Street in Brooklyn Heights, which is the old city of Brooklyn. And behind me is the clubhouse of the Excelsior Baseball Club, the first club in Brooklyn, founded in 1854. Behind me there's a plaque which contains a few true statements and a few false statements. It is true that this is the Brooklyn Excelsior's clubhouse, but it's not true that they moved in here in 1851. The club was founded in 1854. This particular building, served as their clubhouse starting in 1879, really after their heyday as a baseball club. The way this club came about is that it's really a byproduct of the suburbanization movement. You may have heard of the New York Knickerbockers Baseball Club, one of the early important baseball clubs in Manhattan, in New York City. And the Knickerbockers were prosperous merchants, financial district, Wall Street men, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and people of that type in the 1840s and 50s were moving across the river to Brooklyn Heights, using it as a suburb, as a bedroom community, and then they would take the ferry to work. Now, friends, business partners, and even cousins of the Knickerbockers formed a club on the model of the Knickerbockers, and this was the Excelsior Club. It's not the only route baseball took to Brooklyn. Other clubs were formed by other kinds of people. But the big picture was that in the mid-1850s, Brooklyn, a booming city that saw itself as a competitor to New York City in all things, economically, culturally, and in every way, got the idea to form baseball clubs and on the New York model and to beat the New Yorkers at their own game. Like the earliest known New York City baseball clubs, the first Brooklyn clubs had roots in informal pickup games played by people in the same professions, the same neighborhood, or often both. We know that in New York, baseball had ancient connections to the culture of New York City's public markets. So it is not surprising that the famous Atlantic Club of Brooklyn had similar roots. It arose out of the merger of a pickup game that was played on a vacant lot under the present location of the Manhattan Bridge, and another made up of butchers and fish dealers from the Atlantic Market, which gave the club its name. The Atlantics, seen here is the famous club of 1865, quickly became the favorite of most Brooklynites. Whether it was a cause or an effect of the Atlantic's popularity, the club was supported by the democratic political machine run by Hugh Boss McLaughlin, who himself had a fish stall in the Atlantic Market in the early 1850s. The McLaughlin machine gave Atlantic's players no-show and part-time jobs in city departments to free them up to play and practice baseball. The Eckford Club was founded in Greenpoint, where shipyards from lower Manhattan began to relocate in the 1840s and 50s. This print shows the launching of the ironclad ship Monitor at Greenpoint's Continental Iron Works on Bushwick Inlet and the East River. The Eckfords were not initially regarded as a truly Brooklyn club for two reasons. First, most of its members were born and raised in New York City. In the beginning, most of the Eckfords lived in Manhattan and worked and played baseball in Greenpoint. And second, Greenpoint and nearby Williamsburg were part of the town of Bushwick, not the city of Brooklyn, until 1854. Even after the merger with the city of Brooklyn, the so-called Eastern District, which included Greenpoint, Williamsburg, and Bushwick, retained an identity that was somewhat apart from the rest of Brooklyn. As late as the 1990s, our local public high school in Greenpoint was called Eastern District High School. It took a surprisingly short time for the Brooklyn clubs to achieve competitive parity with the older Knickerbockers, Gothams, Eagles, and the other top New York City clubs. The ground had become fertile for baseball's first inner-city rivalry, a rivalry that would transform the game by creating America's first true sports fans. In 1858, the Brooklyn clubs challenged their New York counterparts to a best 2 out of 3 All-Star series. As Game 1 approached, and organizers sensed a groundswell of public interest, they began to worry that the Elysium fields in Hoboken, where the New York clubs played, would be unable to accommodate the crowd of spectators that might appear. The game was moved to the Fashion horse racing track in Queens. This newspaper illustration shows the scene at the Fashion course during the opening game. I'm not showing you the Fashion course as it appears today, because it's not in Brooklyn, and because, other than one street sign, there is no trace of the track remaining. But this game was significant for several reasons. It was the first baseball game that anyone ever paid to see. It charged 10 cents admission in order to pay for restoring damage that would be done to the grass infield by the ball game. It attracted an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 spectators, an unheard of number for the time. The Fashion Course series vividly demonstrated the power of the New York City rivalry to sell the game of baseball. The excitement generated by the Fashion Course series was felt across the country via accounts in the New York-based national sports weeklies. And of course this, baseball's original inner-city rivalry, survives today in the form of the Yankees-Mets rivalry and the Giants-Dodgers rivalry as transplanted to the West Coast. When it came time to settle on an American national sport, the Brooklyn-New York City rivalry gave the New York game of baseball a strong, possibly decisive marketing advantage over both cricket and the bat and ball games played in Philadelphia, Boston, and elsewhere. Around 1860, the Excelsiors of Brooklyn moved from their playing grounds in Carroll Park a mile south to Red Hook. Probably one reason was the growing number of spectators They were turning out to watch what had become the best club in baseball, or the nearest thing to it. Brooklyn had become the epicenter of the baseball world, and fans no longer needed the excitement of New York versus Brooklyn to turn out. The best clubs of the year 1860 were the Atlantics and Excelsiors. Both teams were studded with famous stars. The greatest of them all was Excelsior's pitcher James Creighton, shown here, who pioneered a new kind of pitching that featured unprecedented speed, movement, and command. The Creighton style of pitching changed the game profoundly by turning the pitcher from more or less of a feeder to batters into an important defensive weapon. It set in motion a series of rules changes that ultimately led to the creation of the strike zone itself, the struggle for control of which has been, ever since, the center of the action of a baseball game. In the summer of 1860, the Atlantics and Excelsiors faced each other in a 3-game series that would determine both the championship of Brooklyn and of the nation. Game 1 was played on the Excelsior's new grounds in Red Hook. According to the New York Clipper, quote, "The crowds began to wend their way toward the grounds on Hamilton Avenue, and as time approached for the commencement of play, every available space was occupied." In 1860, this was an open, marshy, undeveloped area. Behind me, you would have seen the buildings of the Brooklyn Yacht Club on the Gowanus. Now, in the summer of 1860, the 3-game series, the long-awaited showdown, is about to take place between the Atlantics and Excelsiors, and Game 1 takes place here. And it turns out a new record crowd, the biggest crowd in baseball history, certainly the biggest crowd since the Fashion Course series, estimated 8,000–10,000 people. Now, they didn't pay admission, and there was no ballpark here, but what they did was they crowded the foul territory behind the infield and grabbed a vantage point anywhere they could. Creighton is dominant in this game, and the Excelsiors win easily. A few weeks later, they play Game 2 in the Atlantic's home field in what's now Bedford-Stuyvesant, then the village of Bedford in Brooklyn. And something unprecedented happened. They pitched the great Creighton again, the nearly unhittable pitcher, and they're cruising along to a very similar victory when the Atlantics knocked Creighton around in the 7th inning, scoring 9 runs off him and winning the game 15–14, which was a shock to the whole baseball world that someone did that to Creighton. In fact, that was the only time in his entire short career he was knocked out of the box as a pitcher. The Atlantics remembered this 7th inning as their lucky 7th that went down in club lore for decades and was talked about. So this set up the hyper-dramatic Game 3. And Game 3 was played at the Putnam's grounds, which is also in the Bed-Stuy area. There's nothing there now. This illustration shows the series opener at the Excelsior grounds from roughly the same spot where I was standing in the previous video. In the early innings of the decisive Game 3, both clubs showed signs of feeling the pressure of playing such an important game in front of so many people. Fearful of making it out and not compelled by the umpire to swing at strikes, remember that this was before there was a strike zone in baseball, batters tired out the pitchers by letting dozens of good pitches go by. With their club down 8–6 in the 5th inning, Atlantic supporters loudly protested the umpire's call on a close play. When the Atlantics made 2 errors in the top of the 6th, the crowd's mood turned ugly. Quote, "Expressions of dissent," wrote Chadwick in the Daily Eagle, "became so decided, and symptoms of bad feeling began to manifest itself to such a degree, that the captain of the Excelsior 9, Mr. Leggett, than whom a fairer, more manly, or more gentlemanly player does not exist, ordered his men to pick up their bats and retire from the field," unquote. The attitude of the Eagle was typical of the press, which was uniformly sympathetic to the Excelsiors. The New York Times wrote, "Shouts from all parts of the field arose for a new umpire, and hootings against the Excelsior Club were perfectly disgraceful. Mr. Leggett was supported by the Atlantic 9 in his endeavors to secure order, and by their united exertions a lull was secured. But although Mr. Leggett distinctly stated that the Excelsiors would withdraw if the tumult was renewed, the hooting was again started with increased vigor, and the Excelsiors left the field followed by a crowd of roughs, alternately groaning the Excelsiors and cheering the Atlantics," unquote. Umpire Thorne confused everyone by ruling that neither club had won the game, but that the Excelsiors had lost by forfeit. The Atlantics claimed victory. The Excelsiors were incensed that the Atlantics would claim a victory that they viewed as tainted. History has accepted the narrative that a rowdy and uncouth crowd of Atlantics fans, angry that they might lose their bets, were so out of control that the Atlantics had no choice but to leave the field, and that it was unsportsmanlike of the Atlantics to accept the victory. The first problem with this version of events is that it is very much colored by the views of one man, Henry Chadwick. The preeminent baseball writer of the time, Chadwick was not an unbiased observer, he was also baseball's chief publicist and advocate. Chadwick had long campaigned for the elimination of gambling in baseball, a campaign that struck many of his contemporaries as extreme. Is it possible that what Chadwick painted as rowdy behavior by disappointed gamblers was nothing more than the enthusiasm of excited fans? None of the contemporary accounts of the disputed game describes or even alleges a single violent act by a spectator. The New York Times used words like rowdy and shameful, but the only acts mentioned were groaning, shoutings, and hootings. In the Clippers version, quote, the crowd began to get uproarious in the extreme, and so insulting were the epithets bestowed upon the Excelsiors that Leggett decided to withdraw his forces from the field, unquote. From a modern point of view, this all sounds a little silly. The Excelsiors walked off the field in a championship game because the opposing team's fans used rough language and booed the umpire? In the days after the disputed Atlantics-Excelsiors finale of 1860, the Atlantics read one newspaper story after another that took the side of the Excelsiors and blamed the Atlantics and their fans for the debacle. On September 1st, the Atlantics responded in a letter to the editor of the New York Daily News, which reads in part, quote, what caused the abrupt termination? Nothing, in our opinion, judging from the language made use of, but the ungovernable temper of a friend of ours on the other side who seems to be getting exceedingly nervous of late. And if the nine is to be called off the ground on all occasions where the pressure is rather high, we think that ball-playing will soon lose its most essential features and terminate in the ruin of the game as our national pastime, unquote. The letter was signed by F.K. Boughton, the Atlantic Club secretary. Boughton's point of view can be summed up as, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. It needs little interpretation other than to explain that the friend of ours is Excelsior's team captain Joe Leggett, who had a history of being rattled by large crowds. The game was stopped because Leggett and the Excelsiors lost their nerve under the psychological pressure of playing the biggest game of the season in front of the largest crowd they had ever seen. What Mr. Boughton and the Atlantics understood, and what the Excelsiors and their supporters in the press seems not to have understood, is that the events of August 23, 1860 reflected a new baseball reality. Baseball spectators had become baseball fans, and fans were part of the game. Booing and heckling are the flip side of cheering and applause, and as any professional athlete of today can tell you, both come with the territory. Now, there's not a lot left of early baseball history in Brooklyn. There are some traces here and there, but Brooklyn, of course, has added 3 million people since the days of amateur baseball, and most of our history, baseball history, has been bulldozed and covered over. But there are exceptions, and they're interesting because public recreation spaces seem to have a certain momentum. So there are a couple of good examples. The first Excelsior's grounds, which was in Carroll Park, Carroll Park still exists and it's still open space. In fact, there's a weird kind of baseball diamond there that isn't at 90 degrees because of space problems. Now, the place that I'm standing here is still recreation space. The soccer field behind me, in this direction, Xavier High School's home baseball field, probably roughly on the spot where the Excelsiors and Atlantics played that day in 1860. Henry Chadwick and the larger baseball community may have been slow to grasp the meaning of the massive crowds that turned out for the 1858 Fashion Course Series and the 1860 Atlantics Excelsior Series, but Brooklyn's business community wasn't. After seeing that fans would pay to watch baseball, leather merchant William Kammeyer decided to add an enclosed ballpark with locker rooms, stands, concessions, and other facilities to the skating rink and recreation center he was building near Wheat Hill in what is now Williamsburg in Brooklyn. Called the Union Grounds, it opened in 1862. This was the first ballpark in the modern sense. Baseball clubs were invited to use it for free, they were the attraction, but fans had to pay their way in. 2 years after that, Hamilton Weed and Reuben Decker opened the world's second enclosed ballpark, the Capitoline Grounds, near the Atlantic's original playing field in Bedford. It also charged admission. It didn't take long before baseball clubs insisted on a share of the gate receipts. Driven mostly by outsiders, spectators turned fans, and non-playing businessmen, this was the beginning of baseball's transition from a participant sport into an entertainment business. Today, there is nothing left of either the Union Grounds or the Capitoline Grounds. The only hint that baseball was ever played there is the fact that schools, an armory, and other public buildings interrupt block after block of brownstones and row houses. What you see behind me is the entrance to Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. This is practically a holy site for early baseball fans, and it's a real oddity because there are cemeteries, there are old cemeteries all across the country, and some of them have famous baseball players in them. But Greenwood has an absolutely astounding number of important early baseball figures in it. Dozens, possibly hundreds. There's no complete count. All right, not only are there members of the great Brooklyn clubs from the amateur era, the Atlantics, the Excelsiors, the Putnams, the Eckfords, but the cemetery's full of members of the early New York clubs, the Knickerbockers, the Gothams, the Eagles, the Empires, etc. And you know, this raises an interesting historical question, which is why? Why are there so many people who played baseball in this era buried in one place? And there are really two answers to that question. And one of them is the kind of people who played baseball. Number one, they were New Yorkers and Brooklynites. New York, until the professional period begins in 1871, and even for a while after, baseball is dominated by players from Brooklyn and New York City and the environs. The second thing is that in the amateur era, baseball players, the early baseball clubs were social clubs formed by a certain kind of person and a certain class of person, and it happens to be the same demographic that cemeteries like Greenwood were founded to appeal to. Okay, we're standing by the grave of Henry Chadwick, who's the most important early baseball journalist, and his importance really transcends journalism. It's the reason why he's in the regular Hall of Fame, not in the one where they put the writers, and I'll explain why. Henry Chadwick was born in England and came to Brooklyn when he was 13 with his father, who was a newspaper editor, and he loved sports, and he was a visionary in the sense that he saw that there was a serious patriotic purpose that sports could serve. He was a participant in a sort of loose social movement to promote sports in the United States. The whole idea of adults playing sports was fairly unheard of in the early and mid-19th century. And one of the first questions was whether English cricket would ever become popular in the United States. And Henry Chadwick spent a lot of his early life in his 20s promoting cricket to Americans. But ultimately, the dog wouldn't eat the dog food. And even Chadwick realized that it was going to have to be, for Americans, a sport that wasn't English. It was going to have to be a sport that was perceived as being a native sport created by Americans. And that gets you into the baseball origin stories, which is a subject for an entirely different talk. But I want to talk about one famous Chadwick story, which I think has been badly understood and misunderstood by almost everyone who's written about it. And it's something that Chadwick would tell over and over again. It was the moment when he realized that baseball was the answer to the question of what is going to be the national sport for Americans. And as he told it in 1856, he's in the Elysian fields in Hoboken, where the New York clubs played, and he's walking back from covering a cricket match, and he sees the Gothams and Eagles, not the Knickerbockers, the alleged first baseball club. The Gothams and Eagles are playing baseball. And what he says is that it hit him right between the eyes that baseball was the sport for Americans, not cricket. And from then on, he devoted himself, he promoted both, but he realized that the future was with baseball. So what was it that he saw that day? And this is sort of a subtle question, and I think it's why people haven't understood it. He knew what baseball was. He'd been a boy in Brooklyn. He'd played baseball. It wasn't that the game was new, or that the game was better in some way, or it had improved while he wasn't looking. Here's what he saw. It was who was playing it and how they were playing it. So what Chadwick grasped better than almost any other of his contemporaries was that in order for baseball to become the national sport, it needed to market itself and be accepted by what some historians have called the emerging urban bourgeoisie. So the emerging urban bourgeoisie is a little bit of a clunky phrase, but who are these people? Until the first quarter and second quarter of the 19th century, society in New York and other American cities was organized differently than it is now. You had the old money families that were wealthy over generations through trading firms and through land principally. And then you had a sort of artisan and craftsman class, a class that really went out of existence. But what began to emerge in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s was a versatile, upwardly mobile, resourceful, economically sophisticated group of people that we recognize very well because they look a lot like the modern American middle class and upper middle class. And these are the kind of people that formed the Hearst baseball clubs. They were Protestant, they were almost all native born, they were a bit moralistic. And this was the issue that Chadwick grasped, is that sports weren't very respectable to these people. And he saw that in order to market baseball or any sport to the urban bourgeoisie, it had to be clean in their view and wholesome. Free of gambling, free of violence, free of drinking, which are three things that were associated with almost every other all-male activity in the American Victorian period, and certainly all sports activities. So things like blood sports, boxing, horse racing, they were not on the menu for the emerging urban bourgeoisie. And Chadwick, this explains Chadwick's almost fanatical opposition to gambling in baseball. He did everything he could to keep it out. Now Chadwick, he was a classic Victorian reformer. And Victorian reformers believed that the way to improve an institution or an individual was a deep understanding of performance and value and measuring those things. So in order to make baseball what Henry Chadwick called scientific, and what he meant it was rational, self-improving, something worth taking seriously, he actually invented most of the basic baseball statistics we use. And in many ways, he's not just the father of baseball, the father of baseball journalism, he's the father of analytics. He invented batting average and most of the basic stats that we use today, and if he would step out of that grave and join us now, he'd be absolutely delighted with WAR and fielding independent pitching and everything else that is going on in the analytics world. That he would find it exciting because they're using numbers to measure performance accurately, reward performance accurately, and improve play and the game itself. In 1908, Henry Chadwick, who was editor of the baseball's official annual, the Spalding Guide, published by Albert Spalding, co-founder of the National League and owner of the Chicago Cubs, went to the opening day game in Brooklyn between the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers, caught a cold and died of pneumonia. Spalding and the other National League owners paid for the lot and this wonderful monument. And I just want to point out a few features of it. The bronze plaque describing Henry Chadwick as the father of baseball, a title that he modestly rejected. You can see the crossed pens indicating his profession of journalism. The baseball equipment is a lovely touch. This sphere, which is a normal feature of a Victorian grave indicating eternal life, is actually a baseball. If you look closely at it, it has stitches on it. And if you back up a little bit, you can see that these markers for the edge of the barrel plot are bases. Here's the leather straps that a base at that time would have to attach it to a spike in the ground. And if it weren't fall, we could see that there are clay base paths here. Probably the most visited early baseball grave at Greenwood Cemetery is that of James Creighton, the starting pitcher of the famous Excelsiors. Creighton's career was as short as it was glorious. He's been called baseball's first national star, and a carte de visite with a photograph of Creighton that was sold after his death has been called the first baseball card. We don't know much about Creighton as a person. There have been varying accounts of how he died, but the biggest missing piece in the Creighton story is exactly what he was doing on the mound. We know from box scores and game accounts that he was very difficult to hit, but it is hard to say why. One obvious possibility is that he simply threw harder than his contemporaries, and that is almost certainly true. But Henry Chadwick, who saw Creighton pitch many times, always said that it was not Creighton's speed that made him dominant, but rather his movement and command. Other witnesses, including batters who faced him, described Creighton's rising underhand pitches and his use of what they called twist or curve. We are not sure what they meant by that, but it raises the question, did Jim Creighton in fact throw a curveball, along with his devastating moving fastball? Okay, here's another problem. This is an 1860 baseball, or something like it. The sizes vary. This one might be a little bit small, but the important part is, you see this stitching? This is called a lemon peel stitch baseball. They hadn't invented the figure-8 stitching that we have now. And if you've done any pitching, or you know anything about pitching, you know that how you grip the ball, what kind of seams there are, where they are, that's everything when it comes to making a ball move. And so, because no one uses balls like this outside reenactors, we really don't know what could be done with a ball like this in terms of break and movement. So the range of possibilities is almost infinite. Creighton could have been throwing a fastball with four-seam hop. He could have been throwing a cutter of some kind. He could have been throwing a curveball. There's an interesting anecdote that I ran across researching Creighton, which was that in 1937, the newspapers were full of plans for the Hall of Fame, which was being established in Cooperstown. And there was a man named James Creighton Parks, a suburban stockbroker living in New Jersey, who got annoyed when he read in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle that Candy Cummings was going to be inducted into the Hall of Fame as the inventor of the curveball. And you can still read this today. James Creighton Parks wrote a letter to the editor of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle taking exception to this. And what he said was, my uncle, and his uncle was James Creighton, the man who's buried behind me. My uncle invented the curveball, but at the time they didn't know what it was. Jim Creighton is a mysterious figure in many ways. Two of the mysteries that historians have struggled to solve are exactly how he died and exactly where he died. So we're going to set those the record straight on both of those right now. Let's start with what we know for sure. In October of 1862, baseball was starting up after a lull caused by the Civil War, and the Excelsiors were starting to play more matches. Jim Creighton was doing what he always did in the summer and fall, which is play a lot of cricket and play a lot of baseball. On October 14th, he was playing in what's now the South Bronx, the village of Morrisania, against the Unions of Morrisania, a game in which he went 4 for 4 with 4 doubles, and he left the game with an apparent serious injury. He was taken home to 461 Henry Street, which is right there behind that tree, that red brick building, and he died in agony 4 days later. There's also confusion about exactly what killed Creighton, and there was confusion at the time. When he died in 1862, there was a weird silence coming from the Excelsiors. There are weeks and a few months go by before anyone really says anything. And if you're reading the sporting press at the time, you get the sense that the cricket community was almost enjoying blaming baseball for the death of this popular young athlete. And this kind of makes sense because cricket and baseball were competitors for the attention of the American sporting community at that time. What's odd about it is that the Excelsiors were full of doctors. The president, Joseph B. Jones, who may have actually treated James Creighton, their first baseman, Pearsall, and many other members of the club were medical people. And it's hard to believe they didn't know how Creighton died and why. Well, the confusion was added to by a story that Jack Chapman told around 1910. And Jack Chapman was an eyewitness to Creighton's injury. The problem is that when he told his version of it, 50 years had passed, and it really doesn't have a lot of credibility, but it's been repeated all the way up until the present day. And what Chapman said was, Creighton was swinging the bat in the game against the Morrisanias, took a mighty cut, hit a home run, and then suddenly there was a snap or a noise, and he said, "I must have snapped my belt." And what Chapman thought had happened was that he'd ruptured an internal organ, say a spleen, and you can still read this online and in baseball history books today. Unfortunately, that's not what happened, and we know what happened because there are two independent death records saying that his cause of death was a strangulated intestine. To die of a strangulated intestine in 1862, the scenario is pretty clear of what happened to Creighton. He was born with a inherited weakness in the what's called the inguinal canal, which is in the groin area, that can cause, when it's exacerbated by lots of twisting, lots of stress, including weightlifting, it can cause a tear in the abdominal muscle wall, and things get bad when a little bit of intestinal tissue protrudes through the wall, and it can get caught in there. Now, if this happens to you today, there's no problem because you can fix this with surgery, and what will happen if it's not addressed is that the tissue will become gangrenous because the blood supply is cut off, and then it becomes infected and you die. So no one dies of it today because we have antibiotics and surgery. In 1862, once you got to the gangrene stage, there was no hope. Now, interesting detail, we mentioned that the Excelsiors are full of doctors. And I checked, the inguinal hernia, the possibility of a strangulated intestine, these things were all very well known. It was a very well understood medical condition in 1862. And the overwhelming likelihood is that Creighton was suffering over a period of months or years with pain and discomfort in this area, and he probably wore a truss. So every one of his teammates knew what he was dealing with, and when he died, they knew why he died. So the question is, why the silence? And I think the answer is some guilt, because Creighton was carrying a huge workload as a pitcher. We also know that the Excelsiors were pioneers of weightlifting and physical training, and this probably didn't help. Back to the where of Creighton died. He died at 461 Henry Street. If you read any reference book, it'll say he died at 307 Henry Street. There is a 307 Henry Street about 10 blocks to the north of us, just across Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn Heights. And it's another mid-19th century row house that historians, reference books, and tours will stop at and talk about Jim Creighton. But that is not the house that he lived in. Even though last time I checked, someone had named it after him. I believe it says the Creighton over the front door. The problem is that these streets were renumbered in the late 19th century. So 307 in 1862 is now 461. That's the actual building Creighton died in. The guilt and grief felt over Creighton's death by his teammates and his team seems to have played a role in the decline of the team. The Excelsiors fell off the competitive curve shortly after his death, and within a few years they were no longer a contender for a championship, and a few years after that, by the 1870s, they'd become like the Knickerbockers, a social club that wasn't really a factor in national baseball scene. It's hard for us to really overestimate the grief and shock that was caused by Jim Creighton's death at the age of 21. For American cricketers, he was the great American hope that we would produce a great cricketer. He was the most important baseball player of his time. He was a great hitter, a great pitcher. He was the biggest star on the best baseball club there was, the team that in 1860 went on a national tour to promote baseball. There were baseball clubs named after him. A whole generation of pitchers imitated his fast pitching. And to some degree, this monument expresses the feelings that his death provoked. Let's have a closer look at it. Here's his name, the shocking details of his death at the age of 21. Here's the seal of the Excelsior's Baseball Club, which is a bit faded by time, but you can see here this is a home plate. That depression is for hammering a spike through it. This is a ball. This is the Excelsior's scorebook, crossed bats, a hat, a spike, and the Excelsior's flag, which is no longer readable. This is a nice touch. Upside down torches are Victorian grave iconography for an early death. These are upside down bats. And if you look up, you can see the pedestal, which looks newer than the rest of the monument, and that's because it is. The pedestal, on top of which is a lemon-peeled baseball, like the one I was using to demonstrate Creighton's pitching, was destroyed in the 20s and replaced recently, thanks to the generosity of broadcaster Keith Olbermann and members of New York City's SABR Chapter, the Society of American Baseball Research. Well, we've come to the end of our tour. I'm now back home in Greenpoint in my house, in my office, where I do my work. And it's not a baseball historical site, although a few years ago I, to my surprise, discovered that it was something like it. I was researching the location of the Brooklyn Eckfords, the Greenpoint Eckfords' first playing fields. The Eckfords were founded in 1855, and like a lot of early clubs, they would play in a rural area, in an open space near a tavern. In this case, a rural tavern called the Manor House, which I knew was located fairly close to where my house is, but after spending years actually looking at maps made before the street grids were laid out, looking at landmarks, looking at where bodies of water were and where salt marshes were, it suddenly hit me while I was sitting in this room that I'd pretty much found the location of where the Eckfords played, and my house was sitting in the outfield. Thanks for coming along on my tour. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Next on the agenda, I'm going to go live, and I'm going to respond to questions from you, the viewers, on issues that came up during the tour. So I'll see you in person in a moment. All right, well done.
What can be said? That was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
So would you want to field questions right now from chat, or would you prefer we can look back here for a moment? But most of them were not questions. They were just commentary. Ralph Carhart, well done, Tom congrats, and
yeah, maybe if anybody wants to ask a question right now, they should go ahead.
Yeah. You want to field them live, Tom?
Sure.
Okay. You can speak your questions if you have
any. Nobody saying anything?
Yeah, and if you do, please unmute yourself.
There is one question there in the chat. Can you talk a bit about Washington Park, from Ken R?
Yeah, sure. So it's a complicated topic because there were many Washington parks, but the site of the first one, which is the first place that the Dodgers played, starting as a minor league team in 1883. It's actually now renamed Washington Park. It was called J.J. Byrne Park for many years, It's between 3rd Street and 5th Street in Lower Park Slope, between 5th Avenue and 4th Avenue. And that was a spot for pickup baseball going back as far as anyone can remember. It was one of those wet areas right next to a slope that wasn't very easily buildable, and people played there before, as far along as we even know. But the Dodgers built a park there for their minor league team in 1883. They went to the majors in 1884. In when was it? After the end of the Players League War, they had to go out as part of the settlement. They went out to Eastern Park in Brownsville. Then they returned to the second Washington Park, or depending on how you count, might have been more than 3 of them. The second one, which was catty corner across 4th Avenue between 1st and 3rd Streets, between 4th and 3rd Avenue. And that one, what they played until they moved to Ebbets Field, 1913. It wasn't destroyed, and the Federal League Tip Tops played there in 1914 and 15. Although they built a new stadium on that, a new ballpark on that site. It's a long subject because the last Washington Park that the Dodgers played in was rebuilt and added to many times, so it's complicated. But there's still one of the things I didn't go to because it's not probably 19th century, is there's a bit of the wall left of the Federal League Park that it's been speculated by me and other people that part of it might have been saved when they built the Federal League Park from the Dodger Park, but that may or may not be true. So it's complicated, but there is this wall, which is the perimeter wall of the Federal League Park, and in the sense, it's a survival of the 19th century in the sense that that was a rebuilt version of an earlier park. So it's, in the sense that new Yankee Stadium, or the last iteration of Yankee Stadium had a relationship with the original Yankee Stadium. It's the same park, but you can go there and you can see a wall of a park that was built somewhere between 1898 and 1914. Most likely it's from the Federal League Park, but we actually tried to prove that, and it wasn't easy. But there's a bit of an old ballpark wall there, and it's very old. It's very old and very interesting and very historic in my view, and Con Ed saved it at the urging of citizens that formed a group to stop them from demolishing it. That might have been more than you wanted on that topic.
Eastern Park is way out in what's today, I kind of know it as the 7-5 precinct.
Yeah, famous for the murder rate.
Yeah, Eastern Park, I know that neighborhood, and it is very remote, it seems to me. But you had mentioned something about, or previously someone mentioned, I think David Dyder, someone mentioned, or even Tom Campanella mentioned the idea of the train. Was that really what that was about?
Well, what's interesting is I don't remember exactly the who's who, but there was real estate interest. That area was being laid out into blocks then, and there were people promoting real estate investment there who wanted the ballpark there. And as part of the settlement with the Players League demise, the Dodgers get moved there, and it didn't work out well for them because they couldn't draw. They were drawing seagulls out there, and there's an interesting detail of that park, which was that I'm trying to remember the exact boundaries, but it was near Van Sinderen, Pitkin, Sutter, and that area. There's still something there. There's like a power station that was an old power station that was used for streetcar lines and subways. It's not very far from a Long Island Railroad station, a few blocks to the north. But at the time that the Dodgers played there, it was basically a sea of tracks. There was all kinds of streetcar lines and railroad car lines that ended there. And I've always wondered, and I haven't been able to totally prove it, but my hypothesis was that that's where the Dodgers started getting called the Trolley Dodgers, because that was a nickname for people in the borough because there was a problem with new fast streetcars. But I found at least one fatality of a fan walking to the ballpark from the Long Island Railroad Station, because they built this platform to walk on, and it would get crowded and people would walk on the tracks.
Right.
So I haven't been able to nail it down, but I didn't find the use of that term Dodgers for the team before that period.
What
So
about
there's more questions. What about what?
I'd like to add a question. What about Weeksville?
Yeah, so Weeksville was an African-American community that's in now what's Bed-Stuy. It was sort of rediscovered 30 or 40 years ago. There are pieces of it left in some of the buildings. You know, what's interesting about, trying to find the traces of African-American baseball in the amateur period, because we just don't have enough information about it because the mainstream newspapers didn't cover it. But there are bits and pieces that we know it was going on. And the main way we know it was going on is that in the 1860s, when African-American clubs were getting organized and getting covered, the competitive level was so high. So they weren't just taking the game up. But one interesting detail a lot of people who know New York history don't know is that there was an influx of African-Americans. There already were a fair number of African-Americans in Brooklyn, and there was a fair number of slaves. Harry Polhemus of the Excelsior's family owned slaves, quite a few. One of them is buried in the family plot in Greenwood. But there was an influx of African-Americans from Manhattan after the draft riots. There was this traumatic racial riot, and I think there was an influx into places like Weeksville, and Williamsburg also had an African-American community, also had a baseball club. There's a game between the Satellites, I think it was, and the Unknowns, I think that was the name of the team. Yeah, so all we know is there's a box score with some names. We can't find out who these people were, but there's a hidden beneath the radar African-American baseball scene.
Other questions?
Yeah, you have some more. There's some more questions there, aren't there, Peter?
Let me just see what we have.
Yes, there are. There are some in there.
Okay.
Did Moonlight Graham play his inning at Washington Park? Yes, he did. And Moonlight Graham's famous non-appearance at the plate took place in Washington Park.
Oh, is that correct?
As did Casey in 1905, I believe, as did Casey Stengel's debut, in which he went 4 for 4.
Wow.
Yeah, one of my fantasies is getting a statue of Casey put there, which would be great. I mean, we need one somewhere.
You got to get Evelyn on that.
Yeah, I mean, it should be not soluble in alcohol, the statue.
Marilyn Miller says, how old was Creighton, and do we have him playing back from the Excelsior days in any box scores? How many baseball stars are in Greenwood? And she goes on to say what a great video.
That's actually Dixie, I think. So Creighton died at 21. And what's interesting is there's versions of his life, sort of summaries of his career that are printed, and a lot of them say, we know that before the Excelsiors, he played for the Stars, and before that, he played for the Niagaras. And both those teams were de facto farm teams for the Excelsiors. People like Flanley and other people moved up the ranks. So the Excelsiors were the first team to sort of have quasi-formal relationships with youth teams in order to get talent. And you can see them moving up a ladder in an orderly way. But before the Niagaras, there's nothing on Creighton. And the problem is he moved to Brooklyn when he was 17, plenty old enough to be a sports star. And I think it's impossible that his ability hadn't been noticed by that point. And I suspect that he was brought across the river by Joseph B. Jones and whoever else was helping in order he would play for the Excelsiors. I think they recruited him in Manhattan and brought him over because I prove in my book that they helped his father get a house at a low rate that he couldn't afford on Henry Street. So it makes you, and there's all kinds of possible scenarios that I explore in my book about how this relationship happened. But the real mystery for me is why how do we not know about him as an athlete before that? I wondered if the records are just lost or if he played under a pseudonym, which some people did. And John Thorne says here, wasn't Creighton the infantile phenomenon referred to in James White Davis's Ball Days song? Yes, that's the really interesting part, because I don't know if you're familiar with this song, but I think it's printed in one of Chadwick's books. For a baseball banquet in 1858, before Creighton has joined the Excelsiors, James White Davis writes a song, and there's a stanza or two about every one of the clubs who's at this big banquet. And he calls, rhyming with, I believe, John Holder, there's the infantile phenomenon who'll play when he gets older. And they never say his name. And it's pretty obviously Creighton. Creighton is someone they know is a coming star who's on the Excelsior's youth teams. And I find it most interesting that everyone in the room was expected to get that joke. So it was not under the, it was known. This guy was already known 2 years before he makes the splash. And his ability was known, his identity was known, and the relationship between the teams was something that everybody understood, even though it wasn't written about in the press.
He was kind of like the Bryce Harper of his time.
Yeah, I mean,
Really, he's
it
known
makes
as a
sense because the guy was such a superior athlete. I mean, Chadwick thought he was going to make American cricket. He was so good.
Do we have any other questions? I think the well is dry.
Could I tell the
I
story
have a
of James?
question.
Yeah.
Yes. Pete?
Were the early clubs prior to admission, prior to when they started charging admission, how did they sustain themselves financially? Was it only through memberships? Did they pass the hat at games sometimes to get the crowd to give them money for expenses?
Some of them had financial backers. The Atlantics had the backing of the local political machine of Hugh McLaughlin. So the top players would get no-show or part-time jobs, easy jobs to help support them. The teams that didn't do that, they supported themselves. And the most common way when they couldn't afford to do that was you would have a huge membership that would pay annual dues. You know, I remember the Athletics at one point had something like 400 members paying like $20 a year. So that was a way you could do it. And there were slightly sleazier ways. I'm pretty sure that the Atlantics, when they did a tour of the Midwest, bet on themselves, and possibly they were accused of playing around with the betting odds, but they had bookies and gamblers with them in their entourage. So that's a lot of different ways is the answer.
Thank you, Tom. Anybody else? Well, I guess we have come to the conclusion of our symposium. Tom, I want to thank you from a couple of levels. This video, of course, is breathtaking in a sense. I'm imagining future uses for it, but we'll talk about that. But also, I want to, you have been the coordinator of this conference. Ralph Carhart has been the panel discussion moderator. We had David Knight involved, and we had Bill Rysack involved on that panel. We had the presentations by Justin McKinney and Brian C., myself and Ralph again. I want to say thank you to you and to every one of them if they were listening for what an outstanding job was really done here. Considering we had to do this on Zoom, and your idea of the video was somewhat of a roaring success, I would say. So thank you all for joining us. There will be, I think in the winter newsletter coming up in January, if all goes as planned, we will announce our next city-specific symposium, interdisciplinary symposium, which will be in a very 19th century appropriate place, by the way.
We're not gonna do another Brooklyn one or two?
Well, not immediately, but you know, we may circle back here because it is so rich. But we have something on the books, and I don't want to announce it yet because it's just some final pieces. We're just kind of negotiating out, but we should make a lot of people happy. Okay, thank you again, Tom. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Maury, thank you again, and we'll see you very soon. We'll be out there again. Oh, by the way, we are still planning for a Frederick Iver Campbell conference, in which Tom will be playing a significant role, by the way. And we will be having that live, we hope and pray, in April 29th and 30th in Cooperstown at the Hall of Fame. We're still on track to do that, and hopefully we can make that live this year. And I look forward to seeing many of you there. I don't see a lot of names here that I recognize and know are pretty much Fred regulars. Okay, so thank you again.
Well, thanks. It was a great job by you, Peter.
Well, you know, Thomas Campanella was, Tom, you led me, he is your recommendation. And
Yeah, well,
I read
that
his
worked
book,
out great.
and as soon as I read his book, I absolutely conferred.
Yeah, no, he was great.
Yeah, he was absolutely great. Okay, thank you again, everyone.